Hello, everyone. Welcome to Planning and Delivering a Diverse User Test. I'm Sharon Spencer with IAAP. And before we get started, I just want to quickly review a few system instructions. Everyone should be logged into Adobe Connect, or you can follow along with the presentation provided and over the phone. To access the presentation, there was a link in the reminder email that was sent out on Tuesday, or in the confirmation email you received if you registered after Tuesday. During the webinar today, if you want to ask questions, our speakers do plan to stop for questions throughout and at the end. If you have a question or comment, just type it into Adobe Connect. You should see the chat area on the right-hand side of your screen. Just type into the text box at the bottom and hit enter or use the send icon. To guard against background noise, I have put everyone on mute. If you are hearing audio over both your computer speakers and the phone, you can hang up the phone and listen via computer only, or you can turn off your computer speakers and listen via phone only. And if you want to see the PowerPoint better, there is a full screen option. Just select the full screen option. There's an icon at the top of the PowerPoint area, and just click on that. You'll go into full screen mode and then click on it again to get out of full screen mode so that you can see the chat area. Lastly, I want to remind everybody that we will be recording this webinar. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us today for Planning and Delivering a Diverse User Test. Our speakers are Joe Chiswick and Richard Bafo-Jan. Joe started working in accessibility in 1995. Since 2002, Joe has worked with AbilityNet as a senior accessibility consultant, where his main role is evaluating websites and applications for accessibility. And Richard is an accessibility and usability consultant for AbilityNet. He has a background in electronics engineering and design and has over 5 years experience in user experience design and consultation, coupled with over 10 years programming experience in back-end and front-end web frameworks. So we are delighted to have Joe and Richard with us as today's speakers. So thank you both. Thank you for doing this webinar, and I'll turn things over to you.
That's great. Thanks very much for the introduction, Sharon. I'm Joe, and I'll be running through this webinar with my colleague Richard. Richard is based at our usability lab in London. So just to repeat what Sharon said, please do ask questions as we go through. We'll either answer them as they crop up in the chat window, or we will stop at the end of each section and try and address your questions then. So the title of this presentation, Planning and Delivering a Diverse User Test. And really the objective here, we're just going to run through the typical steps that we run through when we plan and deliver a diverse or disabled user test, which is something we do regularly from our London office. So that's going to include steps from the very planning and running stages through to actually carrying out the test and then delivering the findings to the user or the client. So who is this aimed at? Really, I'm hoping you've got some accessibility experience, but you may be new to diverse user testing or user testing in general. It may be that you've actually completed a design, or you're planning to build a website and you want to carry out some diverse user testing on your own website as well. And it may be that you're an agency and you want to add user testing to your portfolio of services that you can deliver to your clients and add extra benefit to your designs by reviewing them for accessibility before they go live. So it is important to have an understanding of accessibility just so you can identify and be familiar with the types of issues that users are experiencing and have a good idea of how to resolve them. This can work by including developers in the process as well. So we'll go through some of those aspects as we go. The key sections we're going to be running through, I just want to give it a bit of background to user testing and show where it fits into the project lifecycle scheme of things and the other accessibility areas where you can add extra value for your clients as well. going to be starting off actually defining the project requirements, looking at the planning stage, what aspects you can cover there. And then we'll look at actually drawing up the tasks and the user journeys. Selecting users is obviously one of the more important aspects. You want to get a good range of users when you're carrying out the test, and that can determine, or that can depend on what user journeys you've created, as well as what sort of site you want to review. The actual test itself, once you've completed all the planning, creating the tasks and selecting the users, so we'll run through our typical workflow for carrying out the test, inviting users into the lab, running through the tasks and so on. And finally is presenting the findings. How do you deliver the findings to the user, and what sort of topics do you cover, and how do you lay them out, really? So we'll go through a few options there. So where does user testing fit into the big scheme of things in terms of project lifecycle, project development? To give a bit of background, I just want to look at some of the other approaches that you might be familiar with for evaluating how accessible a website is. One of the very early things that you can do for accessibility testing is carrying out a design review. Now, one of the advantages of this is that you can carry it out very early on in the design process. It allows you to really identify issues very early in the development lifecycle, allows you to address them before they snowball further down the line. And there is actually an opportunity for user testing at this point. You can get users involved reviewing paper-based designs, although we're not going to cover that in depth in today's session. And design reviews can be quite flexible. So they're generally carried out by an expert consultant, someone familiar with accessibility, and it allows them to highlight potential accessibility or usability concerns at that point, but they're generally not strictly guideline focused. Another way of evaluating accessibility that you may be familiar with is carrying out a formal accessibility review. And this is one of the standard ways in which we evaluate the accessibility of a website or an application. So it's very standards based. We'll follow some of the main standards you may be aware of. So there's WCAG 2.0, there's Section 508, there's various other global standards, although WCAG 2 is one of the more common ones. You generally carry that out at the point when you've actually got some content or functionality available to review. So the site may not be completed, but you can also always review individual pages or finished components. And it's generally led by an accessibility expert, someone familiar with the guidelines. So it may be something you carry out in-house, or it may be something you source externally. And then diverse user testing, the focus of today's session really, it's an opportunity where you can get real users involved. So you might already have an accessibility help page on your website. And that gives users a way of contacting you to let you know if they have any difficulties using your site. But a diverse user test is a way for users to give more formal feedback in a controlled environment, so you can work with them to elicit really useful feedback from them. It does cover a range of assistive technologies, so covering people with a range of disabilities who might be using screen readers, voice recognition, screen magnification, and so on. And whilst I actually use these bits of software on a day-to-day basis, I'm not a native user of them. And I recognize that I don't have the same workflow or same pattern of usage as someone who uses that on a day-to-day basis as their main method of accessing a computer. So it's really important to add that level of accessibility checking to a more standard accessibility review. And diverse use testing is really carried out very late on in the development lifecycle when you've got a product almost finished, I would say, when it's either just before launch, or sometimes we review post-launch products as well. And the other reason for carrying it out so late in the development lifecycle is that you want to carry out standard accessibility reviews beforehand, carry out design reviews, and make sure you've addressed the majority of issues. You don't want to waste valuable user time picking up issues that may be addressed more easily during an accessibility review. An accessibility diverse user test will have time for maybe 6 or 7 tasks, which we'll look at later on, and you want to make the most of that small amount of time you have with the user. So for those reasons, it's best carried out during the later stages. I just want to use this page to highlight where the accessibility steps fit alongside the project lifecycle steps. And this is obviously greatly simplified in terms of the workflow. There's a lot more stages in many projects, but these are some of the key areas that I refer back to. So design review goes well at the wireframe stage where you're concocting wireframes. You might have full color or just outline designs for your site, and you can carry out a design review at that point. An accessibility review is when you've got the actual individual pages put together, and just to repeat, the diverse user test comes along almost when the site is complete. So I'm just going to talk about some of the different types of user tests that we carry out. Now there's a moderated user test is one of the main ones that we carry out, and this is going to be the general focus. And I use the word lab-based here to refer to a usability lab, but actually you can do a lot of this testing without a specialist lab. There's a few aspects which we have to change around depending on if you're using a lab or not. But I use the word lab interchangeably with a dedicated lab or a standalone room that you can use for testing. So one of the ways we use the lab, and one of the benefits of this approach, is that people from the client organization who are commissioning the test can come along and watch the test being carried out. And if you're carrying out this test in-house, you might have other members of staff from the development or design team who want to come along and observe the testing firsthand. If you have a dedicated lab, they can do this from a separate observation room without interrupting the test. Obviously, when a user is sitting down working through a website and a series of tasks, it can be quite distracting if they're sat in a room with half a dozen other people. So we generally advise that you just sit down with a moderator. And I'll come back to that a bit more later on. But just to add a bit of context to what I mean by a lab. So another type of user test is actually a moderated remote test. So again, it's moderated. There's a moderator, someone from your organization who's guiding the process, but they're doing this remotely via some screen sharing software like Skype or some usability software like Moray, which allows this remote testing to take place. It works in the same way that you present tasks to a user and they walk through them and you evaluate how they're doing, but you're just doing it remotely. So there's pluses and cons to each of those approaches, which I'll cover on the following slides. And finally, there's a remote unmoderated test. And you can actually get websites which offer this service. Essentially, you're sending a list of tasks to a user. They fill out a report and let you know how they did, and then they send it back to you with how they got on and any comments. It's obviously a very cheap way of doing things, but you do or can miss out on quite a bit of feedback. Some of the pros of a moderated lab-based test, and this is the key one in my mind, is that you're sitting alongside or adjacent to a user and you can watch their facial expressions, you can interpret their body language and see how they're getting on with tasks. That can be very important because there's often a discrepancy between what a user might be telling you or not telling you and what their body language is telling you. You're not reliant on just a single connection. So Skype can drop, internet connections can go down. If you're sitting with a user, you can at least carry on to some extent with a user and ask them questions. Even if the site's having problems, you can discuss their experience so far. And you do have full control over the environment as well, so you can make sure they're using the very latest browsers, which can rule out certain problems and so on. And another key aspect of having a face-to-face test like this is it can be very high impact, particularly if someone is coming along and watching the test. I find it's much more valuable or useful for them if they're able to see the test taking place firsthand. And I might deliver an accessibility report to somebody, and that points out a dozen issues on their website. But when they come along firsthand and somebody from the client organization sees a user struggling, sees them wanting to give up and having a real difficulty with a task, and actually saying, I would stop at this point, I would go to another site, that is an incredibly powerful experience. So I think it's worth getting people along to watch these tests as often as possible. And that's something we do encourage. Some of the disadvantages, particularly with face-to-face testing, is that you're limited, obviously, with your excuse me, just coughing. You're limited in terms of which users you can have access to because they need to physically travel to your location. So if you're in a large metropolitan area, you might have an office in London or New York or a city near you, that needn't be a problem because you'll have a very wide population base you can draw on. If you're in a more rural area, this might well be a problem and you might have to look at remote moderated testing instead. Another aspect to consider is that you do actually need a physical office to do this in. It needs to be physically accessible. So you need to consider physical accessibility like wheelchair accessibility, support for guide dogs and so on. So that might be difficult depending on where your building is. If you're in a listed building, you might not be able to make those changes and so on. So something else to consider when you're deciding what sort of test to run. Just some aspects of the remote testing, still moderated, so we've got a moderator guiding through the test. And a clear advantage, you've got a much wider user base. So we've carried out moderator tests with users abroad because as long as they've got an internet connection, then they can take part in the test. So you've got a much wider audience base from which to draw from and a much wider set of users with different abilities. Users will also be using their own computers and their own software, and they might have them set up in a slightly different way, and they might give more inclusive or more general feedback because they're using a system they're familiar with. They're not having to use the sort of standard setup which might be in place on your testing computer. So users will be more familiar in their home environment, and as a result they'll be more comfortable and perhaps more able to give feedback. Some of the disadvantages that it can be used mainly for desktop testing. I think we have looked at carrying out remote mobile testing, but it can be very tricky to arrange. You might have to sort out cameras and so on to view mobiles, and it's certainly more difficult than desktop screen sharing. Another problem is that, as I mentioned before, you are reliant on what the user is telling you. You don't get the advantage of being able to interpret their body language. So you're fully reliant on what they're telling you down the phone. And you do encourage them to speak as much as possible, but obviously you can't tell when something's being missed. And some technologies, particularly screen magnification, doesn't work very well via screen sharing. So you might be doing remote desktop viewing with magnification running, and actually you will just see a standard size screen. There won't be any magnification. Same with screen readers, unless the user's got a pair of speakers, you're not going to hear that going on in the background. And an unmoderated test, so it's very cost effective. It is one of the key things about it. You could run many rounds of unmoderated testing for the cost of a standard moderated test. If you have already carried out testing and you've got some testers who are quite capable and confident and good at giving feedback, they can work very well remotely. So you can send them a list of tasks and they can come back with some very useful information. But really, you do have to have gone through the workflow of working with them face-to-face first to try and evaluate their strengths. And as with remote-based testing previously, you are reliant entirely on what users are telling you. Feedback isn't always detailed, and if you want to get more information on issues, it can be difficult to follow up issues later on because you write them a letter or an email them, a few days goes past, and it's very difficult for them to remember perhaps what they were doing during the test to feed back further on. And much as viewing somebody face to face is very high impact, reading some quotes from a user is potentially much lower impact, in my view, than seeing the difficulties firsthand experienced by somebody. So in this session, the focus is really going to be on the moderator tests and whether that's carried out in a usability lab or without a usability lab. So you might have a separate room put aside, and we'll just discuss some of the differences as we go through. Now, I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Richard in just a second if he's available. But I just had a question there. So how do we capture key presses when testing keyboard users or screen reader users? So in a lab, you can use various bits of software, and we use a bit of software called Moray, which is dedicated usability software, and that will actually capture and log key presses as part of a timeline. So you can record the actual video of a session, and it will actually record all of the key presses that a user uses when taking part in a website. We don't carry out any like focus tracking, watching where users are looking on a screen. That's something else you can do to track how users are interacting with a website. But certainly Moray is the only method I use that tracks key presses. I don't know if my Richard has anything to add to that before we go into the next stage.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me there?
Yes, can hear you fine, Richard. Thanks.
Yes.
Fantastic, fantastic. Now I'll go straight into the next section. So let me just first introduce myself. I'm Richard from AbilityNet. I'm involved in auditing and user testing at our labs in London. So first of all, what I'm going to go into first is defining the project requirements. And essentially, this is the first stage in carrying out a user test. Essentially what we're asking is, what do we want to get out of this test? So the first thing that happens is usually there's a kickoff discussion, and that consists of a face-to-face or phone contact with the client. So you sit down with the client and ask, what are the project requirements? We then take a walkthrough of the website or application to understand which sites or pages may be looked at. We then ask, what are the goals or the purpose of the website and application? How will users understand? How will users understand how to navigate the website? And also, what kind of tasks the users may complete. So, for example, if it's filling out a mortgage application on the banking site, for example, essentially, the client can be a third-party client or someone within your own organization who's wanting to commission a user test. The task that the client is looking to have evaluated should relate to the core purpose of the site. And for who the site's aimed at, an internet portal may require employees from the company involved. Whereas financial services website may want users with specific background knowledge of the finance industry. So we really have to look at our users to understand how potential people can come in and be involved within the user test. Okay. So first of all, we look into access to the site application. So we look at how to access the site itself. Do we have the right links or the right URL to the App Store, for example? Need to look at any pre-release sites. So if you have user acceptance testing or staging websites, to make sure that they can be accessed from the lab themselves, wherever the lab is in the world. And to ensure that pre-release mobile apps are installed manually. So whether the application developers provide a Google Play or an iOS App Store link, or an internal or enterprise link as well. And also, we have to ask, is dummy data needed? Will users be able to navigate through the website itself? Will it make sense to users before it goes out live? And also, lastly, a schedule of the testing. Hopefully the site should be stable when it's undergoing a user test. And we want to make sure that enough time is left for the developers to make the last changes before testing does take place. Okay. It's going into reporting requirements. So look at how the client wants the feedback. In some instances at AbilityNet, we either provide videos of the user tests, or we can provide a snippets of videos, or we can provide findings via a webinar or face-to-face, remotely or in a workshop session where we can discuss the findings themselves. If using video capture software, we usually produce a highlights reel. This highlights reel can be created by using snippets of videos with captions, which provide enough information for the client to be able to understand what is taking place in a particular task and the outcomes of that. However, it can be a time-consuming process, and if you do have the option of doing this, it can be very useful if clients cannot attend. We also look at producing standalone reports. These can be quite lengthy Word documents which take the client through each task performed by each participant. And we also use PowerPoint presentations for high-level reporting, so grouping similar tasks together and providing an overall report. And video highlights as well if need be with the PowerPoint software as well. Okay, going into client attendance. So what we found that in some instances we have clients come down to our labs to observe what is going on in the user tests. Watching users experience difficulties firsthand can be quite a powerful way of highlighting accessibility issues with websites and apps. And so we recommend, wherever possible, people from the client organization come along and watch the testing as it happens firsthand. Usually this is only possible within a lab where there's a separate observation room. So we found that developers can find it useful, for example, attending user testing, as they can really see the high impact of any problems that users have within an application or website. And often this starts to begin the discussion of how to address issues as they occur. And there's also a benefit for managers and designers to be involved in the observation as well, so that, again, the discussion can continue amongst the developers, managers, project managers, and developers as well. So in some instances, you may wish to introduce clients to testers, if possible, to get even more direct feedback. In some instances, you may also wish to perform post-test interviews as well, which provide the tester a platform to describe any issues that they may have had that haven't been accounted for within the user test. I've been in tests where developers have been actively trying to fix issues as they were being spotted. We tend not to recommend this. It can be useful to wait to get consensus between project managers, designers, and developers before then going ahead and addressing those issues. So going to look into user requirements. This really talks about who we look for in the participants in terms of conducting a test. So we look at target demographics. So for a publicly accessible website or application, then you tend to have more free range over selecting your users. So for example, if it's a banking application, you may wish to get a wide variety of users from across the spectrum who may be able to use the site to do certain tasks, such as check their balance or apply for a loan, for example. If you're looking to test an intranet site, however, you may be restricted to selecting from internal staff. This will influence how many users you recruit and what disabilities will be represented. So it may be worth going around your organization and asking different people if they are willing to be a part of your test as well. Also look into various backgrounds, any specific background needed, and also the number of participants as well. So it's great to have a wide range of participants. So in terms of the number of participants for a test, usually four testing sessions can take place within a day, usually an hour to an hour and a half. This allows for a reasonable break between each session to write up notes, gain feedback, and have a debrief with observers as well. Okay, we'll look at an example of Amazon. So Amazon is an example of a publicly accessible website. So anyone can be expected to use it, and there are no real user restrictions. In this instance, the Amazon site is responsive, so it would be worth testing on mobile and desktop. However, what we found is it's very unlikely that users have time to switch between platforms during a test. So if you want to test desktop and mobile, it may be worth conducting the test separately, unless there are very few tasks to perform on each device. Alternatively, you may want to split your group into two, one mobile users and the second desktop users. As the primary purpose of the Amazon website is allowing users to purchase goods, this will determine certain scenarios. Users should not have to enter their own details when conducting a user test, but it may be possible to arrange for a dummy account to be used to ensure that any payment or personal details processing can go as far as possible without affecting the participants' let's say bank account or delivery address. Okay, going to pass back to Joe to talk about tasks and user journeys.
Thanks, Richard. So I'm just going to carry straight on into the next session, into the next part of the webinar. If you do have questions, though, please just add them to the chat panel. I can stop at the end of a session if necessary, but otherwise I will just plough through. So following on from what Richard just commented about user journeys, I'm just going to talk about how we identify those user journeys and what is a user journey as well. So user journeys are really entwined with the whole purpose of the site. You know, a site is designed to meet certain user journeys, and therefore they're probably going to have been developed and considered very early on in the design process. So the client, if they're a third party or your own design team, should be well aware of what perhaps some common user journeys are. So it's worth getting them involved at this stage. As I mentioned, they might actually have already been created. So, you know, if you're just coming to a website as an agency, you can ask the client what the user journeys are, but it may be they've already been created as part of the design brief at a very early stage. And if so, it's worth using those. We might as well adapt those because they'll have been used for in-house testing, perhaps used for acceptance testing. We can use them again for diverse user testing. And in addition to using the standard user journeys, I think it's good practice to include more general discovery tasks as well, which perhaps aren't specific to each site, but give users more of a free range to feedback without being, I guess, guided along a particular journey. They can comment on the homepage and so on. So defining a scenario. So a scenario is really just a series of steps, or a task is a series of steps, but actually by turning them into a scenario, you can add a bit of context to the user and make it a bit more relatable, add a bit of background information, in the same way that when you're considering a demographics for a website, you might come up with a series of personas in the same way that they are more relatable for designers when they're talking about this user having certain difficulties, or how would that user use the website when they've got names, background, histories, and so on. You can create scenarios to make tasks more interesting and relatable for users. So they just help to explain why the user is wanting to do a certain action on the website. So just a very brief example, you might have a task which, when you first write it down, use the journey planner to get from point A to point B, from Manchester to Newcastle. Now, I think that's bad for a number of reasons. You're not giving the user any background. You're also telling them almost what to do to use the journey planner, whereas the point of the session might be to discover, can the user find the journey planner? So, I would reword that into something, give a bit of background to it, tell the user what they're doing. You might be visiting Manchester for work and you want to arrange a visit to see friends in Newcastle when you finish on Friday night. And in that way, you're just adding a bit of context to the task, and it makes it more interesting for the user, something they can understand and relate to, hopefully, a bit more. So some general task advice then, just following on from that, make tasks realistic as well. So you don't want to give a user one task which covers 15 different steps on a website. That might not be something they do. So a user isn't going to book 5 holidays at once on a holiday booking website to try out all those different aspects. Instead, you would ask the user to complete a single scenario, a single task, which is believable for them. Generally, not all the time, but in general, tasks should be actionable. So they should have a defined endpoint so you can measure success. So that might be finding out a particular bit of information, finding out the last train time for a particular destination. It might be adding a certain object to a shopping basket. And by that way, you can determine if a user completed a task or not. And as I showed in the previous slide, it's good practice just to avoid leading language and avoiding giving the user any clues on how to complete the task. So try and avoid using language or terminology that's used on the website itself. As well as some specific tasks, I find it useful to ask generic questions, often at the very beginning of a session. So you might ask a user to have a look through the homepage or the landing page of an application. What do they think about it? What sort of information do they take away from that? What sort of site do they think it is, or what purpose does it serve? You can also ask the user about their usual browsing techniques, because different users will access sites in different ways. So screen reader users will often have different techniques than other screen reader users, and that's something we come across in a lot of testing. So ask the user to describe how they usually interact with websites, and you can get some good general feedback. And also try and establish how familiar a user is with a particular site. If a user has used a financial transactions website, an investment website before, then they can refer back to that and compare it when they're evaluating this new website. So you can ask the user, how does this compare? And it might explain why they have different expectations compared to a novice user. So it's useful to get a bit of background from them as well. So some general guidance around creating tasks as well. We say that 6 to 7 tasks or scenarios for an hour-long test is normally sufficient, and some users will undoubtedly complete all those 7 tasks. Some users perhaps won't for various reasons. So plan no more than 6 to 7 tasks and then add in a couple of generic tasks at the very beginning. I like to randomize the order of tasks for each user as well, because we can't guarantee every user will complete all 6 or 7 tasks. If we randomize the order and start them off in different points, we can be sure of getting a good spread of completed tasks. Otherwise, task 7 might never be completed throughout the whole test. Again, when you're writing the tasks, just to repeat, avoid using terminology and leading language that's already used on the website. And then for each task, not only you can determine its success, has a user been able to complete the task to your satisfaction, but also get some feedback on how they found it. We use a sort of number scoring system, so 1 is very difficult to 5 being very easy, and that allows them to sum up how their experience of completing the task as well. Obviously, that's worth bearing in mind when you're sort of interpreting their body language, I guess, and you can see they might say it was very easy where clearly they had a few difficulties. So you obviously have to compare that with your own notes, but it can still give some valuable feedback. Just got another example scenario here. So adding a bit of context for the user. And this I just want to show you this example scenario very briefly on the screen, written out in text. So you've had your first child, want to open a savings account for them, and you decide to visit your nearest bank to open an account. And the task is to find the address and how to get there. Now I've laid this out on this slide as I would when I'm actually preparing it for use in a test. So the advantage of doing it this way, you print each task on a separate sheet. You can easily print them out and shuffle the order for each test participant. You can actually pass over to the client and they can, or the tester, sorry, and they can read through it if they just want to confirm any details. And you've got some prompts on there to remind you to note down the score and the success rate, as well as add in your own notes. When you're writing the tasks themselves, realize it may be an iterative process. So that the client may have given you the key user journeys for a website, and you've converted those into a series of scenarios. But once you've drafted those, you'll often want to send them back to the client for review or somebody in your organization so they can see if they're happy with them. And that might be an iterative process. You might need to repeat that several times just to refine the tasks until you're happy with them. So that's all happening before the test itself. So once you've got the tasks established, that should give you an idea of the bank of users that you're going to want to use for this testing. So if you've not carried out any user testing before, you will have to have a think about how to recruit users. Now, how are you going to select users? First of all, what sort of users do you want for your test? So it may be that you want to base your selection criteria on the type of disability. You might have a site designed to meet particular needs, or somebody might have developed a new app for screen reader users that might guide your selection. It may be that you're targeting a particular technology. So you're reviewing a new mobile-only site or app. You're going to only want people who are using mobiles for that review. And also location. So I mentioned before, if you're conducting tests in a lab or an office, you're going to be slightly restricted in terms of location where you can recruit users from. You're going to want to recruit users who can physically travel to your offices. So that means you're just working in a certain range. In most cases, however, probably only the last one is going to be, the location is going to be the overriding factor for you, because you're going to want basically a representative set of users to review any content, just so you get broad feedback. Because most websites and most apps are going to be used by members of the public, and it's very difficult for you to determine in advance what their needs are. So with that in mind, I'm just going to outline the typical set of users that we make use of in a test. And this does vary slightly from test to test, but I just want to give this as a bit of background information. So we generally have, from a bank of 7 or 8 users in total, we'll have 2 screen reader users. Now, there's a few reasons for this. From experience, there's many more issues that affect screen reader users than any other demographic. And in addition, we do find that screen reader users often share or have different workflows and different patterns of how they use websites. So by using 2 different users, we're covering 2 sets of workflows and more likely to find any relevant issues. We include someone perhaps with a learning difficulty or dyslexia or some literacy difficulty. They might not even be using any assistive technology. They might have difficulty reading text on screen and therefore take a bit longer to complete tasks. And because of its prominence, you know, there's a huge number of people with dyslexia, and as an invisible disability, it's very difficult to gauge accurate numbers, but there are a large number. It's very critical to test against that demographic. We also try and include elderly users as well. Elderly users might not consider themselves to be disabled by a sort of standard measure, but we do know that disability increases with age, and there are some acquired disabilities later on in life, such as reduced dexterity, reduced vision, and so on. And whilst they might not tick the box that says I'm disabled, elderly users might well experience some loss of vision or some loss of dexterity, which means they have a different experience of using a website. So it's important to have that covered as well. And again, that might be influenced by the website you're evaluating as well, whether you want to include more people from a particular demographic. Keyboard-only users. So actually, this is representing a standard accessibility checkpoint as well, that all content must be keyboard accessible. So it's particularly useful to include keyboard users in this set of users. Low vision users as well, so we try and include a low vision user, and they might be using screen magnification, they might be using just large text in browser, which is available in just about all browsers now, or pinch to zoom obviously in a mobile context is very available as well. And finally, voice recognition users. So people using Dragon Naturally Speaking is the most prominent one, but it's actually built into a lot of operating systems now. Just a very brief note on software, because you will need to consider this, is things like screen readers, particularly screen readers in fact, less so screen magnification and voice recognition, they can be very expensive. So some of the ways you can address that are you can change your testing criteria. So you might, instead of using something like the JAWS screen reader, which is very expensive, you can use NVDA screen reader, which is free. You can use some of the built-in speech recognition into Windows, and many mobiles will have built-in screen readers already. In terms of recruiting users, there's two key ways you can do this. You can look internally. So if you're a large organization, chances are you will have employees with disabilities already, and it may be they would enjoy being able to improve the accessibility of your website. So you may already know them, and an advantage of that is they've probably got licenses for the assistive technology as well. They won't have any travel issues if they're already working on your location where you're carrying out the test. And you can easily involve them in retests as well. So when you're carrying out a recheck further down the line, you can get the same users involved, which can be very powerful. If you are an agency, you're wanting to recruit externally, a few ways you can do that. Maybe you can advertise on Twitter using hashtag of your local town. You could post on forums. You can follow up perhaps if people have contacted you directly via your website about difficulties accessing your website, and that may be why you're doing a user test. You can follow up with them and see if they want to be involved and also help you improve the accessibility. Something you need to consider, of course, in this is monetary costs. So you're going to be paying testers for their time in coming along and covering their travel to get to you. So you need to bear those aspects in mind as well when you're recruiting testers externally. So that's just a bit about the users. I'm just going to hand back over to Richard now, just to give a bit of background on the actual lab itself.
Hello there, Richard again. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about setting up the lab. So where should a test take place? If you have a usability lab for in-house UX testing, then great, you can use this already. A lab is not strictly essential for basic user testing. A standalone room will do, although there will be some aspects of testing not open to you if you do go down this route. If you don't have an in-house usability lab, which not many organizations do, you could look into hiring one from a local UX agency. However, if you're going down this route, you'll be better placed making use of the testing expertise of the agency as well. So it's great to work together with them to really bed down your testing regime. Assuming you want to carry out a user test yourself and on site, then the key requirements for a user test are a separate accessible room. By accessible, it should conform to accessible building regulations regarding such properties as doors or sufficient width for wheelchairs. So talk a bit about the layout of the usability lab. Hopefully it should be a separate testing room and observation room. And if you can, as possible, make sure the rooms are as soundproofed as much as possible so testers are not distracted by any discussion that happens in an observation room. We do recommend noises kept to a minimum in the observation room. We recommend having a one-way mirror separating the two rooms. This allows viewing of the tester firsthand by observers and any clients that may be in attendance without distracting the tester. The tester is placed facing this mirror for the test. A computer link between an observation room and the testing room means anyone in the observation room can watch as the tester navigates the site and follows the cursor around. So this could be used using a CCTV system, or for example using Moray system, which allows transmission of the screen to the observation room. If you don't have a dedicated usability lab, an option is to see about partnering up with an agency. You'd be advised to commission them to carry out the testing themselves and use it as a learning opportunity. We also make sure that the mic and speakers are good enough to to transmit the sound to the observation room as well. Lovely. So you can test in a standard office. It's important for the moderator to be sitting adjacent to the tester and have a visibility of the tester screen. So that means that the moderator can keep an eye on the tester's body language and be able to see the screen in case of any issues with the device and app. The moderator may also wish to make notes while they're moderating, just to make sure that any observers or developers may wish to gain feedback from them. The observers should be positioned out of the line of sight of the tester, but near enough that they can hear throughout the test. So there should be adjacent space for the moderator to be able to conduct the test. Preferably, the test should be situated in a quiet area, away from prying eyes and other people, let's say, around an office. And a door should be shut to ensure privacy as well. So in terms of lab equipment, we usually recommend a standard desktop computer with a monitor that is over 22 inches. We also recommend speakers for screen reader users so that the moderator can hear and also the tester can hear what is being said. We also recommend a headset for any voice recognition users so that they can hear themselves and also use the microphone effectively, as a normal microphone may pick up noise from rooms adjacent. Any additional software used by testers, you may need admin rights on the machine to install the software or change any Windows settings so that the computer is suited for the participant. It's also great to have the latest browser updates installed as well, just in case. So going on to recording the test. It's helpful to have software for recording the screen. We are very used to Moray, which includes Moray Recorder and Moray Manager, and Moray Observer as well for observing the test in other rooms. There's also other software such as Camtasia, which is very good for recording one-on-one user sessions. Such software allows you to record both the screen and what the user is clicking on, but also a picture-in-picture view of the user as they browse the site or application. So this allows anyone wanting to see facial expressions as cues as to how the user is getting on, and also any commentary can be recorded as well. We advise using a webcam, preferably a 1080p webcam so that there is enough resolution for the recording to be clear for any developers or managers to look at the video later on. It's also handy to have a second computer. With a second computer, you can then insert markers into the recording, which enables for video editing later. This can denote where each task starts and each task finishes, and also any additional comments or markers that you wish to add to make sure that either video editing or review of the video can take place smoothly. It just means that you can refer to specific points in the video later on. Okay, I'm going to pass back to Joe, and he'll be talking about the moderator.
Thanks, Richard. In actual fact, because we've just talked about the lab, I'm just going to ask Sharon to put a poll up on the screen regarding do you have access to a usability lab? I just wanted to get a bit of a feel for, so thanks, Sharon. So I just wanted to get a feel for how many people have actually got access to a usability lab, whether it's in-house. Or otherwise have access to one. So that's a fairly even split. I guess larger companies are more likely to have an in-house user testing team anyway if they're able to design and develop products. User testing is something they'll want to do. Okay, so almost exactly an even split there, which is really interesting. Like I said, it's really important to realise that if you don't have a usability lab, a dedicated one, you're really not prevented from carrying out user testing. It is something you can do with a very minimal setup, and whilst you can make use of a lot of tools and bells and whistles, it's something you can carry out with a computer, some users, and a moderator at the very minimal end of the spectrum. So, on the topic of the moderator, I just want to go through a few points on the role of the moderator. Hopefully you can see from the picture here, it's a lion tamer. That denotes their responsibility. They're like guiding the test, and they're responsible for making everything goes as it should do. So they're essential for the running of a productive and successful test. So what does the moderator do? They're really responsible for the overall test, and that covers everything from welcoming users at the beginning of the test, making them feel at ease. They present each task to the user, and in fact they're likely to have been involved in writing and preparing the tasks in the first place, so they'll have the behind the scenes experience too. They'll be prompting the user with additional questions, particularly when users are, perhaps you've got a new user that they're not used to thinking out loud, and the moderator can then prompt them and encourage more useful feedback. Because they're right there, then and there, moderators can also resolve any difficulties. So if the user is stuck at a particular point or the website has a 404 error, that's something the moderator can help with to bypass those difficulties. And obviously, because they got the first-hand experience of working with the user, they're seeing all the difficulties they're having, they can make a lot of useful comments to write up into the report afterwards. Also writing down the user's scores, when they score themselves, how easy or difficult was a particular task. That's something the moderator can do. So alongside moderators, we've got the role of the observer or observers, which Richard is just going to talk a bit about.
Fantastic, thank you, Joe. So, with the observers, it may not always be possible to have observers if you are a very small team, but it does make the testing process more thorough, as you have help capturing issues that come up in the test. So, where is the observer placed? Usually in a lab setting, the observer is in a separate observation room, unseen by the user. However, if they're in a non-lab setting, the observer should sit out of line of sight for the user. So they may be in the corner of the room, just observing what is going on as the test is performed. The role of the observer is to log progress and any issues that are encountered, to keep track of any scores and success rates, how many times a task may pass or fail, and to also operate any usability software such as Moray to ensure that the testing process runs smoothly. Okay, going to pass back to Joe to discuss more about the test.
Thanks, Richard. So once you've worked out the role of the moderator and the observer, come up with the tasks and so on, is the actual testing process. And I'm going to assume that you have 2 members of staff available for this test, a moderator and an observer. If you only have 1 member of staff available, obviously you need the moderator and they'll have to make more notes by themselves. But really the test is the end result of all this preparation. So I mentioned before about the number of tasks, 6 to 7 tasks, and we say allow 1 hour per user. That's about the maximum we like to get users testing for, because it can be quite tiring, can be quite an intensive process, and an hour is a good break point, getting the most out of each user. It is important to realise that not all users will get through the tasks, so some users might be happy to stay a little bit extra at the end, but some users will want to stop after the hour, so you might not get through all the tasks, and that's fine as long as you realise that and work through them in like a random order, as I mentioned before. And then having a sort of 30 to 60 minute break, I advise, between each testing session. That gives you enough time to, grab a glass of water, get some more sheets printed out for the tasks, or get them all ready, but also comparing your notes with the observer as well and writing any additional comments. You can write so much while you're sitting next to a user, but once the session is finished, you can take that time and write down some more in-depth notes while everything's fresh in your mind. So scheduling the test, 4 users in a day for an hour each is probably a good starting point. In terms of a pre-test checklist, so when you get into the office, perhaps on the day of the test, you want to make sure that you've still got access to the site, make sure it hasn't stopped working, or there's nothing you need to do in order to get it working. If you are running software like Moray, it's useful to do a quick test recording, making sure that sound levels and so on are okay and it's capturing the screen. In a similar way, if you do have a lab and you've got a separate observation room, do just double check the volume levels, because the observer is going to be reliant on those, as are any clients you may be visiting, to actually observe and appreciate the test. So you've tested the room and you've got users starting to arrive. So the first part is actually you greet them and show them into the testing suite itself. You want to make them feel at home, offer them a drink, ask how their journey was. You want them to feel comfortable, so they're going to give you more feedback, and it can be quite intimidating, I guess, going into an environment like a usability lab for the first time, so you're a bit unsure about what is entailed. So it's useful to make them feel at ease. I always outline the purpose of the test. So we're here today to evaluate the accessibility of this website and try and make it better for people with disabilities, and reassure them about the testing process. We're testing the website, we're not testing the user. So any problems that arise are to do with the website and not the user. So I've just got an example how I might start off, introduce someone to a testing exercise. I'll tell them my name and I'll tell them the name of the website we're looking at today. And then I'll tell them about any colleagues who might be observing as well in the observation room, as well as if there's any people, developers, designers, managers from the website in question coming along to observe as well. I think it's very useful and important to make users aware of that. They might not be able to see them. In fact, they won't if it's behind the one-way mirror, as we discussed earlier. But I think just making them aware of people who might be observing the test remotely is only fair on the observer, on the tester. Again, I reassure them once again, and I do this throughout the test, we're testing the website and not you. So it really just makes the user hopefully feel a bit more at ease. And then we'll outline the expected behavior, how I want the user to conduct themselves throughout the test. And that's a bit more informal than I've made it sound, I guess, but I'll tell them the website is still in development. And we really want to do everything we can to make the website as usable as possible. So I'll tell them that we're going to be working through a series of tasks. I'll just describe the workflow to them, and then I'll describe each task to you and then ask you to complete it. And that's what I'll explain to the tester. So I also asked them to use the site navigation to complete tasks as much as possible rather than just searching on a site. Because many users will default, if they can't find what they're looking for, they'll often just search for it on a website instead. Now, arguably that's something that users do, but I find it more valuable to watch them interact with navigation and see how they're interacting with a website. So I encourage them to use that as much as possible and then just use the site search as a last resort. And I guess the main thing is encouraging the user to think out loud. This is something they won't be familiar with if they haven't done user testing before. But we want them, because that's our way of getting access to their thought processes. So we watch the user and interpret their body language, and we can tell when they're feeling a bit confused or unsure. But also we're reliant on what they're telling us. We want them to walk us through their thought process. You know, why are they clicking on a particular link over another link? What made them choose that? What do they expect to happen? So if something didn't go according to plan, you could ask them what they expected to happen when they followed a link or pressed a button. And asking them what they're looking for just sort of prompts them to recall the task or scenario that you presented to them and can help them find their way out of a dead end and continue the task in hand. So encouraging the user to think out loud is a vital part of the testing. This might not be relevant if you're not using a standard lab or you're not recording the session, but if you are going to do some video recording of the session, have a disclaimer for the user to sign, just to show that they're aware of the video being recorded and that it's going to be used as part of the website improvement process. We do confirm with users that it's going to be anonymized, so whilst they might be able to see their face in the picture view on the video, we're not going to use their name, and their details aren't going to appear in the report. So get the user to sign the disclaimer form as long as they're happy with that outline, and just show that they're happy and they're aware of that taking place. So I mentioned before, it's useful to start with a generic task, and that can just help users feel at ease. So it guides them into the test, gently gets the test started. So ask them to have a look around the homepage. What's the first thing they notice? What do they think the purpose of the site is, and perhaps who the site is aimed at? That'll get them thinking on a sort of non-action based task, I guess. And once you've done that and got them used to thinking out loud and telling you what they're doing, you can begin stepping through the tasks. So it's useful to outline the task, and I actually read out the task number as well. So I'll say starting task 4, and that's primarily for the observer or any people who are watching remotely, so they can log it in Moray and they know which task we're starting. Because if we're doing them in a random order, they need to know that information. I'll then read out the task to the user, so they want to have some flowers delivered to their wife's work address, find out if this florist delivers to that address, and then observe the user as they're working through that task. You want to watch them primarily, let them think it through, and just observe how they do. You really don't want to interrupt too much unless they look stuck. We'll encourage them throughout to give feedback and think out loud. Ask them, what are they doing? What they might have expected to happen when they clicked on a particular link. Ask them and remind them, what are you looking for? What bit of information? What's the task? What are you trying to achieve? And that might prompt them to look further at the page in question. It's also useful to get a feel for how the user might address something. If they have a particular difficulty finding some information, ask them what they would do to make that information easier to find. Would they perhaps order it in a different way or use some different link text? And that's one user who's giving that feedback, but if everyone gave the same feedback in a user test, that can be very valuable and help guide some improvements to a product. After each task, I said before, you want to ask the user how they would score the task. That gives some general feedback, and you can use that to sort of add some quantitative feedback within the report as well. If every user found every task very easy, that typically bodes very well for the website. You should note down yourself whether the task was a pass or not. Did the user succeed at the task? And that might be somewhat subjective because a user might have given up on a particular task, or there are technical difficulties that prevented them from completing it as well. And you'll also want to note down any actions relating to how the user did. So you might want to note down the user clicked on this link expecting this to happen, and that did not happen. That might have prevented the user from finishing a task. Once the test is completed, you want to thank the user again for their time, realise they may have travelled some way, so it's good to offer them a cup of tea and perhaps offer to order them a taxi as well. You want to make the whole experience not an uncomfortable one for them, so they're more likely to come back and help you test in the future. Confirm that any payment details with them, any travel costs you're going to cover. And now, in between tests, it's a very good time to go through the session with the observer and just have a debrief and discuss your findings. You might find they differ on key points, or more likely you've covered different areas and you've noted down different key points and what potential problems were. So whilst it's fresh in your mind, it's really the very best time to have a debriefing session with anyone who may have observed it. So I'm just going to talk a bit now about presenting the findings and how you might deliver these to the relevant organisation, your client or someone within your organisation. So as part of the requirements gathering stage we looked at earlier on, you will have determined what is the best format, whether you're going to use a PowerPoint, you're going to have a presentation and present findings firsthand, or you're going to put things into a sort of standalone Word report and send them over. We will assign issues a priority. So as we're inviting down issues into the report, we'll order them in terms of user impact. How much did they affect the user from preventing a particular task being completed? High impact means the user basically could not complete a task, through to low impact is perhaps a minor usability issue that affected one user. So a few different things affect the priority. Mainly it will be the user impact if they could complete a task, but also the frequency. Did a particular difficulty affect every user or just one user? That can also affect what priority you note down for that. On determining the priority then, I find it useful just to group all the high priority, medium priority and low priority issues together respectively in the report, because many developers and designers will want to focus on them in that order. They want to knock off all the showstoppers first of all, and then work down, and if they've got time, finish off all the low priority issues. It's also very useful to actually refer back to users in the report as well, so you can comment on this particular user had this issue. And because we want to anonymize the user data, we'll just refer back to them using shortcodes. So for a screen reader user, we'll perhaps just have SR1 and SR2 for screen reader users. VR for voice recognition users and so on. And that allows us to easily say that when this issue happened, so on this slide I've just got an example issue here, when this issue happened it was users, voice recognition and screen reader users were affected. They were unable to use a video player to watch the how-to guide, so we're describing what the issue is. And the outcome of this is that they were not able to open an account. So watching the video was a prerequisite. If they could not watch the video, they couldn't open an account, and thus that would be a high priority issue. The recommendations then, so you identified an issue and you want to make a recommendation. They can be tricky if they're technical, if they involve code level changes, but by describing what the issue is in the way I've just done, you can perhaps give a clue to the developer and they'll have a better idea on how to address it. If you are technically minded and you're quite happy recommending sort of more technical accessibility fixes, once you know what the problem is, then by all means go ahead and include that. It's also worth pointing out that we have some power users, some very capable screen reader users or other disabled users with a development background, and they'll actually feel able to provide fixes themselves or describe the expected behavior. So they encounter a carousel or a media player, and they'll be able to say, They might have required some prompting from you, the moderator, that was a play button they navigated onto, but they would be able to tell you that that should be announced as play, or that should be a pause button. I would interact with the slider with the arrow keys and so on. And that's all information you can feed back to the design and development team to help them address the issue and get it fixed. In terms of presenting the report, so you can include video highlights if you have done that. You don't need to keep them long, but you can just include a few key highlights that show users having real difficulty, or even the converse. You can show users saying, this site was very easy to use, and that's very positive feedback to give back to developers, particularly if they're aware of accessibility and they've obviously tried to incorporate that. It's very valuable, I find, to go through the report face-to-face. So present it in a webinar or even a face-to-face presentation, and that allows you to discuss in more detail the issues as they come up. You can even demonstrate some of them if you've got a computer or mobile device with you, and allow people to see them, which can just add a bit more context to reading it off a slide. And then presenting the report very soon after the test is complete as well. You want to do this whilst it's fresh in your mind. You want to get the report written up and presented very soon after that. So if anyone has any questions, you can think back to the test, you can work out what was happening, put yourself back in that mindset, and hopefully answer those questions. Some of the other things you might be able to cover in a face-to-face presentation of any issues, you can obviously describe users' reactions and go through their body language in a bit more detail. You know, several users, whilst they didn't say this was a problem, appeared to find this task particularly difficult, and that might be something you look at in more detail. And you can also provide quotes from users as well on what constituted a very good point of the website, what they would do to improve it if they were given a chance, and any suggested fixes as well. You can go through those that users may have suggested fixes, but also you can go through your suggested fixes and engage in some dialogue with developers. It may be that they're quite happy with some fixes, with others they may be restricted by a particular development framework they're using. So one fix is more difficult, perhaps you can provide an alternate fix as well. So it's often not just a case of presenting the findings and then letting the client get on with fixing all the issues, but really engaging in dialogue and working through the process until they've finished fixing the issues. Okay, so you've presented the report. So I'm just going to sort of summarize the previous tasks. I'm aware that this has been a whistle-stop tour because there has been a lot to go through. And I do advise you, if you haven't, to actually download the presentation and go through the notes yourself. So the different types of tests you can carry out, there's moderated in-house or remote tests. They're most likely what you're going to be doing, but unmoderated is where you can send tasks out to a user and have them complete them at home. So the very first point in designing a diverse user test is getting the requirements, working out exactly what you need, what the critical user journeys are, and what information you need to create tasks and scenarios from these. Once you've got those, you can create the tasks, and you can add scenarios and add a bit of context to these for users, making them more engaging. As I said before, it's good practice to randomize the order of tasks and just make sure there's a good coverage of tasks for users to complete. And then it's really selecting the users. So do you need to know any recruitment? What's the typical user base? What's the target audience? In general, you're going to want a representative set of users, so users with a wide range of disabilities to take part in this test. But it may be you've done a particular website or app which has a very specific focus and you do want to draw from a particular demographic. In the actual test itself, you're going to welcome users, make them feel at home, make them feel as comfortable as possible, and outline the purpose of the test so they know what's going on. Start off with generic questions, so ease them into the testing process by letting them describe what they think of the homepage. And then it's just a case of working through the scenarios and tasks you've presented and letting the user complete each task in turn, asking the user what they thought of the task and getting them to score themselves, and then marking down their success rate as well. And then after each testing session, have a debrief with the observer. So make sure you write down as many notes as possible while the testing session is fresh in your mind. And finally, we've just really looked at this, but the next step is reporting the findings. So very important, prioritize issues first of all, just so you've got it. And you should have a fairly good sense check, but that's something you can discuss with the observer. You might disagree over the priority of issues, and that's something you can discuss as you're writing the report. For each of the issues, it's worth noting down who is affected by the issue, why were they affected by the issue, why couldn't they complete a particular task. And that just adds a bit of context to each of the issues in the report as well. Makes it more real for when developers are working through, if they can attach a real person to each issue. So refer to the people by those shortcodes I mentioned. Face-to-face delivery is, I think, the preferred mechanism of delivering reports, or at least via a presentation that you can talk through with them, just so you can add as much extra information as needed and engage in dialogue with the user, or sorry, the client who's perhaps commissioned the report from you. And if appropriate, you might want to have a follow-up user test. So once the issues have all been fixed, you might want to run a separate user test to make sure they've all been fixed. And in being fixed, have they introduced any further errors? So that might be the case, and you might have another round of testing. So that is, I'm aware we've got a bit of time now, so there might be opportunity for questions if anyone has any on either that summary or any of the other sections we've been through in this session. But I'll leave that slide there, and I've got a few minutes, I think. I'll double check with Sharon.
Yes, we have just about 9 minutes, which is great that you left time for questions. So let's open it up to the attendees to ask a question or to make a comment. Just type it into the chat area. You'll see the text box down at the bottom. Just type in your question or comment, hit the enter key, or you can click on that send icon, and then Joe and Richard can address your question.
Thanks, Sharon.
So let's just give it a few minutes to see. Go ahead, Joe.
Sure. I was just going to say as well, if we could just put the final poll-up on the screen as well. Are you likely to run a user test in the future? I'm aware that I didn't put the beginning one up about people who've carried out a user test in the past, but if we could put up the final one, it might give us an idea of if people are thinking about running a user test anytime soon, or they've got one scheduled in. That would be really useful to know.
So it looks like this webinar was timely, that people are planning to do testing in the near future. Okay, well, I don't see anyone typing in questions, so let me just do a couple of things before we close out our webinar. First off, I want to thank Joe and Richard for doing such a great job. A lot of information covered in today's webinar, so thank you guys. Thank you both.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yes, thank you, Sharon.
And I also want to thank our captionist, Jeanette, with TCS Interpreting. As always, she does a fabulous job keeping up with all this information. So thank you, Jeanette. And what I want to do now is I'm going to put up a slide. We have a link in this slide to our feedback survey. So I want to encourage all of you to click on this link. We really appreciate your input on each webinar that you attend. So please do fill out the survey. I'll also send it out in a post-webinar email to all of you. But we really appreciate your taking the time to fill out the survey. I also want to just let everyone know about the webinars that we have coming up. And of course, you can see all of the webinar schedule throughout the end of the year. That's on our website. Just go to our website, accessibilityassociation.org, and go to the education section, and you'll see both live webinars and then also access to archived webinars and webinar bundles that we have. But upcoming, we have audio description, the visual made verbal. That's on August 23rd. And then on September 27th, we have how to use JAWS screen reader to verify accessibility features in a web application. So I hope you'll consider joining us for future webinars. And it looks like we have a comment. Thanks for all the info. Like your use of phrase user journeys, which I've been calling workflows for ages. So great. Thank you for that comment. So just a last, I don't see anybody typing in any questions. So just to let you all know, the way to log out of Adobe Connect is you just simply close your browser and hang up the phone if you're connected via the phone. So again, I want to thank Joe and Richard for the great job that they did. And with that, our webinar has concluded, and I wish you all a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.